Hi, Andrew Bell with you once again. And my goodness, aren't we living in such disruptive times? So much turmoil everywhere that it's very difficult for people to live a relaxed and balanced life. Won't it be great to get that federal election out of the road? I don't recall any election being so negative and so focused on much of the past with no inspiring vision for the future. One of the core drivers of our real estate market has always been population growth. Population growth is important not just for the real estate, but for the economy in general, as it keeps building demand through greater numbers of people year on year. Certainly in the real estate market, an annual population growth of over 300,000, such as we've experienced in the years leading up to the pandemic, were vital for driving new construction to meet that growing population, as well as providing demand for resale properties. Of course, the borders were closed back in 2020 when the pandemic first started, and this had an immediate effect on population growth. We've maintained natural population growth, which is more births and deaths, although we haven't got the official figures on that yet, but it does generate somewhere close to about 100,000 increase in population per annum. The balance of our population growth then comes from overseas immigration, which was always necessary, not only to provide growth in our economy, but also to bring in important gaps in skilled labour that we required to fill. We know, for example, there's a desperate need for more doctors, nurses, engineers, and as we've all heard, all sorts of people to assist in restaurants, on farms and so on. With a lack of immigration, we've seen over the past, say, 2 years, it is impacted by driving up labour costs, which has added to our current outbreak of inflation. But it's also restricted businesses. Many restaurants on the Gold Coast are only running at about 75% capacity, as they can't find additional staff to open the balance of their restaurant. Throughout our country, different products and produce has not been generated because there's just no labour available to make that happen. So, as a result of the borders being closed, Australia has just recorded its lowest annual population growth in more than 100 years. Now the borders have opened, and there is an expectation from Treasury that Australia will resume their age-old trend of heading overseas for work opportunities after being stuck here at home for over 2 years. This will only add to the skill shortage that we already are experiencing. So it is important to get overseas migration up and running again. We'll have returning overseas students, which will help with some of the part-time work requirements, but we also need to bring in that skilled labour. And this, of course, will then create a problem in the short term, but will also help in the long term. Now, the short-term problem is that much needed skilled labour coming to Australia will add to the housing demand, particularly in the rental market, therefore adding to price pressures on real estate, both in rental and in purchasing. But it will help in the longer term by boosting our economy. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. Net overseas migration has been revised for the 21-22 year from about minus 42,000 to a plus 41,000. But the big jump occurs in the 22-23 year with an expectation of 180,000 new arrivals, and by the year after around 213 and back to normal. But there was always going to be that void period. We will never have a catch-up of the near 400,000 people that didn't migrate to Australia during the pandemic period. It's interesting to see that around 1 million people have entered Australia since the borders opened up on November 1st. That figure shows that about 130 of those were international students, 190,000 were tourists, and pleasingly 70,000 were skilled migrants, whilst a smaller selective group of just some 10,000 were working holiday makers. Isn't it fascinating to think that we were down some 400,000 international migrants, yet we had such a housing stress, both in the rental and the purchasing properties? Some of this can be explained by the fact that new developments were lagging for quite some years, and so the supply of new properties weren't forthcoming. But it's also partly explained by the massive shift in internal migration around Australia, so that there are areas where there are an abundant amount of properties available, but sadly not in the areas where people are seeking. There's a huge migratory shift within Australia, which has seen large numbers of our existing population moving to Pacific regions, putting enormous pressure on pricing in those areas. I will have a closer look at that at the next report. But for now, expect that resumption of normal population growth will continue to put pressure on our housing stock supplies, both rental and purchase. If we don't get a boost in construction in the areas where the demand is greatest, then there'll be no easing of that housing crisis that is much talked about. And this is so real in so many areas. Great to have Ray White's Chief Economist, Nerida Cornersby, attending a market briefing for our office last week and to provide us with some fabulous insights. I'll also provide much of that material in the weeks moving forward. But if you'd like more specific information, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can provide that for you. Well, of course, there's been a lot of questions about interest rates, but we have to remember that rising interest rates are happening right throughout the world, and our interest rate settings are actually more attractive than most other countries. For anyone who's been borrowing money for real estate for the past 20 or so years, you'll be more than aware that rates we've been on for the past couple of years are mind-bogglingly low. And even with the proposed interest rate rises of 2 or so plus %, they're still historically incredibly low. Any rise in interest rates will affect perhaps high borrowers, and particularly those who bought recently. But for the great majority of Australia, they shouldn't have a hugely detrimental effect. Well, interesting times ahead. Look forward to being with you in a fortnight's time. Stay safe till then.